One of the aspects that I love about the Bible is that although it was written to a specific audience with their own specific cultural context and their own geography and their own time and place, is that we can often see connections with this original audience and make parallels to today, to our own cultural context and time and place. And today we're looking at a passage where Jesus very subtly, he highlights a group of people who are somewhat famous and they're incredibly influential, but the basis for their fame and the basis for their influence is on appearances and how they appear to other people and the facade that they create in order to ensure that everyone around them knows that they have got this carefully curated facade of their external self. And these group of people are called the Pharisees. And when I think about our modern context, when I think about our cultural time, I can see that we increasingly also have a similar situation where we've got a group of people who are somewhat famous, or trying to be at least. They're incredibly influential, but the basis of their fame is how they appear to other people and this carefully curated sense of their external self so that everyone just knows how well they look. Because one of the most important values in our society is that appearances matter. And today we're going to be looking at this big theme in this passage that we're looking at, that you've heard that appearances matter. But concerning righteousness or concerning right living, Jesus says it's your heart that matters the most. And you might know that we're in week 3 of our Sermon on the Mount series. And this is the Sermon on the Mount was seen as one of Jesus's most famous pieces of work. I'm sure that people have said that in the previous sermons. And it was arguably one of the least understood sermons that has ever been preached, and definitely the least obeyed, isn't it? It was John Stott who originally said that. And the major theme of the kingdom of heaven is what reigns throughout the whole of this text in Matthew chapter 5 through to Matthew chapter 7. And it's presented by Jesus at the beginning of his ministry, because Jesus has become an adult and he's come out and he has said, I have come to preach that the kingdom of heaven is near. So let's have a read of the passage that we're looking at today. We actually cover quite a lot of ground. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, right through to the end of the chapter. So if you have a Bible, it'd be wonderful for you to open that and read along with me. But I'm going to start us off by reading just the first few verses from Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 20. Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. You know, if you had heard the sermon as a whole, if you were one of the original audience listeners, then this would have been a real breath of fresh air to you. And this, especially if you were a disciple, if you were a follower of Jesus, and you were not part of the religious leading elite called the Pharisees. See, this whole manifesto, or this whole sermon, and particularly the chapter that we are looking at today, it describes what human life and human community and human flourishing look like under the gracious rule of God. And the thing is that it's strikingly different to how the original audience would have heard this and seen in their everyday life. And even to us as a modern audience, 2,000 or so years later, that what Jesus talks about in here is actually strikingly different and very countercultural to how we experience life in our modern day life. So I want to just wind the clock back a bit. I want to give you a little bit of context, because some 1,500 years or so before this sermon was preached, that was given God's instructions on how to live within his kingdom reign, another set of laws were given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. Famously, you probably know the 10 Commandments, and subsequently another 230 laws were actually given to the Israelites, given to the people for everyday life. And these laws, they spoke into how to relate to God, how to relate to your neighbour, laws about marriage, about property, about livestock, about hygiene, and about right living. Because the law was set up to originally to help people relate to and connect with a holy God. And as time went on and throughout history, the Israelites, they did their best that they could to sort of uphold this law as best that they could. And what happened was this group of people emerged called the Pharisees. And these were a group of people who were the religious elite. And this is my AI-generated imagination of what they would have looked like. And they were known for their obedience, and they were known for their strict adherence to the laws. And they'd gather in groups, not this guy, he's on his own, but normally they'd gather in groups and they'd saunter around the towns and they'd pompously sort of show off to everybody just to ensure that everybody knew just how religious they were, just how pious they were by how they kept the laws. And what they would do is they would take one of these laws and they would sort of create this meticulous way of obeying it so that the whole of their life was revolving around trying to keep the law in order to maintain their external sense of righteousness, in order to maintain their appearances of keeping these exact details of the law. But the frustrating thing about these Pharisees is that sadly, most of it was for the show. And there wasn't much dedication to knowing God personally. See, the everyday Israelite, they didn't have a hope of being as externally good as a Pharisee. And everybody knew it. And so today, in this passage that we're looking at today, Jesus really begins to expand on what we're calling this upside-down kingdom of heaven theology. Because Jesus turns it on his head and he says, you've heard that appearances matter. But concerning righteousness, Jesus says it's your heart that matters the most. See, this law that was given all these centuries earlier, it had become a yoke. It had become a burden for the Israelites to carry, especially with this constant reminder of the Pharisees kind of lording it over them and sauntering around and making sure that they knew that they were better than the everyday Israelites. I don't know if you grew up with an older brother or sister who skites about how good they are or how much smarter they are than you. My 8-year-old often says to my 6-year-old, I know all my 5 times tables. And this man, Jesus, he turns up on the scene and there's rumours that he might be the Messiah, that he might be the one, the promised one to rescue Israel from their oppressive leaders. He's going to be the one to come along. And naturally, an everyday Israelite, they would think in their mind, they would also assume, this Jesus man, if he's the Messiah, then he's going to abolish the law. He's going to do away with the law. He's going to get rid of it completely. And if he's the Messiah, he's come to set us free, right? And what's keeping us enslaved? The law and the law keepers. So Jesus has to correct them here by opening up today's passage with, do not think that I have come to abolish the law. Don't think that I have come to get rid of it. I've not come to get rid of it, but to fulfill them. What does that even mean? It means that Jesus is literally, in the Greek, Jesus is literally the filling up of the law and the Old Testament. And what this means is this includes 3 things. This includes Jesus is the filling up of the Torah, which is the whole first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is also called the law. He's the filling up of all the predictive prophecies about a coming Messiah who is going to rescue Israel. And he's also the filling up of the moral law of God that we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Jesus is all of these 3 things in his physical presence. He is the perfect man. He is the Messiah. He is the one who is sent by God to come into humanity so that humanity could have a relationship with himself. Because remember, what was the law originally set up to do? To help people relate to and connect with a holy God. So when Jesus says that he's the fulfillment of the law, he's saying that he is the way to a relationship with God now. Not the keeping of the law, not the keeping of the rule book and all of its sub-laws and bylaws and addendums, but that he is the way. And what this does is this actually gives Jesus a credible amount of authority to go on to speak into the rest of the chapter that we're going to be looking at today. And what Jesus does is he brings 6 examples of some common laws that the Israelites lived by, and he reinterprets them. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 1 or 2 of them today. We don't have time to unpack all of them, but I want us to have a read of a couple of them and see the patterns that emerge and see the way that Jesus unpacks them, so that later on today or tonight or later this week, you can go back and you can read through to the end of the chapter, and you can also see the patterns and see the themes for yourself there also. So the way that Jesus starts to give this interpretation of the law is interesting, because he starts each section within the same sort of way. And he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago. And he describes the law. But then he goes on to say, but I tell you. And he gives the interpretation. And the method of these illustrations, it actually highlights, when he does it all 6 times for all 6 different laws, it actually highlights how the Pharisees' way of living had infiltrated the everyday Israelites' thinking when it comes to creating cultural traditions around obeying the law of God instead of the law itself. And see, what this meant is that the Pharisees, they would actually either limit the law or they would loosen it depending on their own convenience. And what I mean by this is we've got 6 illustrations here. We've got, Jesus talks about murder, he talks about adultery, divorce, oaths or speech and how honest you are, retaliation, and loving others. And the Pharisees, they had either limited this behaviour to the act alone, as in the case for murder and adultery and retaliation and loving others, or they had loosened it, as in the case for divorce. And what this meant is that it just basically, this suited their own version of the laws and the self-concerning righteousness. Because if they were seen to be not committing murder, if they were seen to not be committing adultery and making a real show of it, then everyone knows just how well the Pharisees are keeping the letter of the law, because appearances mattered the most to them. And Jesus actually comes along and he speaks new life into these laws. And he makes this stark illustration that it's not the literal interpretation and it's not the appearance of keeping the law that matters the most, but it's actually the state of one's heart when it comes to keeping the law. So let's have a read. If you've got a Bible, I'm reading Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 onwards, but if you don't, just listen along. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, fool, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. See, Jesus is making the point here that the Pharisees, they promoted a rigid and a formal external conformity to the letter of the law. And Jesus is suggesting a far more radical, inward, deeper interpretation that reveals the state of one's heart when it comes to keeping the law. And this is a revolutionary interpretation, right? And to be honest, if I was an original audience member, if I was listening at the time, I'd be sort of shifting in my seat a bit and feeling a little bit, uncomfortable for how confronted I am. If I was an original listener and I had come along because I had heard that this man Jesus, he might be the Messiah, he's going to do away with the law, he's going to do away with the prophets, and finally that means he's going to do away with the oppression of the Pharisees. And then he speaks into murder, and I think, well, I'm fairly sure, I'm quite confident I haven't committed that sin, even unintentionally. And then he turns it on his head to include hateful, prideful things that I've thought, or angry thoughts that I've thought, things I've yelled at my kids, things I've thought about the parking wardens in Wellington, Things I've thought about when I got a $150 parking bus lane driving ticket. I'd be gulping a bit, and I'd be really confronted and I can imagine that I'm not the only one. Everyone else would be sort of shifting in their seat also and quietly convicted about the state of their own heart and how we harbour anger there and its relation to murder in God's eyes. Okay, well, he's moving on to another topic. Okay, here we go. The next topic is adultery. All right, Phil, this is also a topic that I'm fairly confident, a sin that I haven't committed because I've been a happily married woman for 13 years. So let's have a read of this. Reading from Matthew chapter 5, and it's in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Okay? But I tell you, that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Womp womp. Oh no. Jesus, he's loosened this interpretation to include not just an illicit sexual encounter with someone that I'm not married to, but he's expanded it to include where I cast my glances, a second lingering look, the things that I imagine being said, or things that I laughed about, or the sustained eye contact that I have, or private jokes, or late night text messages, the films I watch, the articles I read, and you know what it is for you. And Jesus' commands here, there's quite a grotesque illustration, isn't it, to cut your hand off and to gouge your eye out. But it's an illustration to say that Jesus takes sexual sin seriously. And while it's not a prescription for us today, we don't actually have to go around and physically chop off our hand and physically gouge out our eye, because all of us would be walking around handless and eyeless. But Jesus, what he's not saying, just don't worry about it. Just do nothing about it. He is saying go to whatever lengths you need to go to in order to keep yourself from giving over to sexual impurity. And he wrote this before the internet was invented. And again, to the original listeners, this would have turned the concept of adultery, which is sexual relations with someone that you're not married to, would have completely turned it on its head. See, because Jesus casts the net far wider and actually far from the actual act. And again, he goes far deeper to the state of one's heart, to your attitude and your posture of omitting sexual sin from your life. He goes on to 4 more topics, and unfortunately we don't have time to actually look into them today, but can you get the picture here? Hopefully you can actually go away now and you can read the passages for yourself, and you can see how the Pharisees, they created traditions and they created interpretations of the law of God for their own convenience, for their own external sense of justifying their own behaviour. And when Jesus comes along, being the perfect Messiah, the Son of God, he actually speaks with far more authority than into the surface level righteousness or right living, that it doesn't cut it in God's eyes. So the Pharisees, they made their own pretty high standards for right living, a rod for their own back, if you will, and a rod for the Israelites' back as well. But Jesus challenges the original audience, and he challenges us today. Do not interpret God's favour of you. Don't think about how righteous you are based on your behaviour alone. But didn't Jesus say that unless our righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, then we will not enter the kingdom of heaven? Not that we'll be least in the kingdom of heaven, but that actually we won't even be a citizen there. So the Pharisees made their own cultural standard for honouring God and keeping the laws pretty high, but now Jesus is coming and he's making that standard even higher. How on earth is there any hope for any of us to enter the kingdom of heaven at all? Right at the very end, if you read through to the very end of chapter 5, Jesus actually says at the end of that chapter, Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus is asking for perfection. There's another New Testament author called Paul, and he writes in the book of Romans that the law in and of itself reveals sin. How else do you know that something is wrong unless the law has been made to determine right from wrong in the first place? And now Jesus is going and he's widening this concept of righteousness, not just to include how you appear to other people, but also your innermost thoughts. Surely by this standard, all of us are short of his perfection. Well, knowing my heart, infinitely short of his perfection. So where does this leave us? If we stop the conversation there, then I think we're left a bit helpless, aren't we? See, if God created a law system in which it was pretty difficult to maintain a relationship with himself by adhering to the rules and the regulations, and then humanity comes along and tries to create our own facade of righteousness through external behaviour, and then Jesus comes along and he interprets the laws to include our sin as our inner world, as our thoughts and our attitudes, then we have no hope on our own strength of ever entering into a relationship with God or the kingdom of heaven by our own strength, by our own good deeds. And I believe that this is actually Jesus's point exactly. Because can you remember what the very first sermon that 2 weeks ago when this sermon was opened up, what Jesus's opening words were for the whole of this manifesto of the sermon? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, blessed or happy are those who admit that they can't attain their own righteousness. Blessed and happy are those who admit that they can't attain their own holiness and their own power alone. But that the kingdom of heaven actually belongs to those who live in the reality of their shortcomings before a holy God. Blessed are those who know the genuine state of their own heart and all the anger and hatred and prideful thoughts that are kept there in selfishness and lust that keeps them knowing that they are spiritually bankrupt before a holy God, and that these people are the ones who receive the kingdom of heaven. Paul says in Romans, and again he goes on to say, Christ is the culmination of the law. And this means that he is the final piece in the part that the law plays in gaining righteousness before God. See, obeying the law as a way of gaining access to a relationship with God, it's played its part. It had its time for a time in history. Before Jesus came along, it actually showed people right from wrong. It showed people highlighted how to live a right life and how to relate to God. And in another letter that Paul writes, he writes in the book of Galatians, he says that the law was our guardian until Christ came along, that we might be justified or we might be declared right by faith. So when Jesus comes and he says that he's the fulfillment of the law, he is the personification of the prophetic imagery that God is going to write the law on people's hearts. That's what he says in the book of Jeremiah. And Jesus being the culmination of the law means that salvation is no longer attained through adhering to the law, but by believing in Jesus, by believing in his work on the cross on our behalf. And Paul says again in Romans that righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, not to all who achieve perfection through good works. So some people would argue then, well, if righteousness is gained by faith alone, then why does Jesus even expand on the law to interpret it and include the attitudes and the states of our heart? Well, I believe he does two things with this. He shows us something about God and it shows us something about people. Firstly, it reveals that only God is perfect and that Jesus himself is God. Jesus is the only person who is blameless before a perfect God. And he is the fulfillment of the law. He is the fulfillment of the prophets. That he is, in fact, the Messiah that Israel had been waiting for. And the second thing that we learn from Jesus expanding this interpretation of the law is about people. And it causes us to realize our own spiritual bankruptcy before him. So when we read the law of God and we make mental checklists for our good deeds versus our bad deeds, and we sort of, tick off, well, I haven't slit anyone's throat recently and haven't had sex with someone that I'm not married to, well, I'm doing okay, then we can become self-reliant, can't we? We become self-reliant on our own sense of righteousness in order to rationalise our behaviour as, well, I'm not that bad. And I wonder, even if you're a Christian, if you're prone to doing that in your own life today, or you're prone to taking on our cultural norms of what good behaviour is and adopting them as our own. Because this passage shows us we can't attain righteousness in our own strength and just by behaving well. But one thing this passage does do is it reveals the state of our heart. So when we read Jesus' interpretation of the law and how to love other people and how to speak and regarding sexual purity, it shows just how far away we are from God's standard that we actually live. And instead of letting that condemn you, I really pray that you'd see this as an invitation to examine yourself, to examine your heart attitude, to go away and to read these passages and to see how your attitudes and see how your heart does and doesn't match up with God's standard. I want to encourage you to read these passages, and when you do, you reflectively ask God, where in my own life have I taken on cultural traditions of morality and made them my own? To really seriously ask yourself, where am I keeping up appearances instead of walking in the way of Jesus? I've sat in this passage for the last few weeks over the summer, and it has really wrecked me and confronted me a lot in terms of my attitudes and my own walk with Jesus and how much I value external appearances. So by way of concluding, I think about a reflection for each of us, and I think about, each of us knows our own hearts, and each of us knows our own thoughts and our attitudes, and those ones that we keep carefully hidden from other people, and also the ones that we carefully curate so that other people know just how good we are, or for what we create for other people to see. But this passage, it blows the door wide open on our inner world, doesn't it? And on our motives. But the incredible thing about Jesus reigning in our hearts is that, and over our lives, that if we're followers of him, that he changes our desires. He changes our inner world. And as we know him more, as we walk with him more, we want to become more like him. We want to leave the way of how the world walks. We want to walk away from that. We want to become more patient. We want to become less judgmental, more pure, more honest. So by way of response to this passage, you could pray a prayer. If you're a follower of Jesus and you've been reading this passage and you see just how far away you are from God's standard, you could say, Lord God, would you show me in my own life where I have adopted the culture's moral standard for living instead of yours? God, would you help me to turn away from that behaviour, and would you change my inner desires? Would you change my inner thoughts and to become more like Jesus? Would you show me in my own life where I've adopted an external appearance-based faith and help me to walk authentically in your ways? Perhaps you're not sure if you're a follower of Jesus, but you want to be, and you've listened to this message today, or you've been quietly watching for a little time now, and you could pray a simple prayer like this that tells God that. You could say something like, Lord God, thank you for this message about the kingdom of heaven. And after reading this passage, I'm so aware that my good deeds, my external behaviour, it's not enough to gain a relationship with you. But that's belief in Jesus Christ that does. Thank you that he is the way. Lord, I believe in your Son. I believe that he's the Messiah. I believe that he came to be the way for me to begin a relationship with you. I thank you that he was the perfect man and he took on all of the wrongdoing that I had done, and he gives me his perfection in my place. I'm sorry for the wrong that I've done, but I thank you that Jesus is the perfect man, and the work that he's done on the cross, that he forgives me. Lord God, would you change my heart? Would you show me how to live in your ways from now onwards? The original listeners at the time, They would have had a lot to think about after they had heard Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And my prayer for each of us is that as we sit in this word and as we go ahead and read it for ourselves and sit in it and read it and reread it, that Jesus would continue to change our hearts, that he would continue to soften our hearts so that we walk authentically with him. Remembering that although we've heard that appearances matter, Jesus said it's the state of our hearts that matter the most.